Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing on this wonderful day to have it in spring, and we're not living in Seattle anymore, and life is good. My name is John Gardell. I'll be your presenter today. I've been doing these for 3 years. I think just about everybody has been here before, so I don't need to do an introduction on myself. My wife, Jana, is our technical person, and she has baked today, don't worry. People have checked. They check around town if they see her on the streets. They want to know what she's making, but she takes good care of us, and we appreciate it. So today we're going to be talking about the history of the Middle East, part 1. Now, originally I had planned it to be a single presentation, but then as I got into it, I would say there's no way I can do this in a single presentation and do it any sort of justice. So we're going to be going to 1930 today, up to 1930, before independence, and giving a lot of background, because the Middle East is complicated. And of course it's controversial. So without really understanding the background, it's very difficult to understand the situation today in the Middle East. So this is what we're going to aim at. And as always, if you have questions, Judy's sitting in the front row. She'll take care of it. my Google. And good to see you here, Judy. Thank you for coming. So the agenda today, the essential question, which event do you believe was the most important in the history of the Middle East to 1925? So you don't know that yet, but hopefully after the presentation. Because I was trying to think of a good essential question that didn't just drag everybody to the present day, because that'll be next month. So I was trying to think of one that would work for the time period we're going to be covering. So what we're going to cover today is the ancient history, pre-Islam, then the development of the Islamic culture, the Ottoman and Safavid dynasties, the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks, World War I, the struggle for independence, the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations mandates, and then we'll have a discussion. And of course, Palestine will play a major role in this as well. I probably should have put it on the agenda, but that'll play out. So what is the Middle East? Well, it's a transcontinental region centered on Western Asia. And if you think of Western Asia, I'll show you a map in a minute, but it's basically the Arabian Peninsula, and Iran is kind of the Western Asia, but also includes Turkey, both Asian and then across the straits into European Turkey, Constantinople, Egypt, and North Africa. And of course, there's other places that in today's world we talk about the Middle East. In 1900, the Middle East was referred to as the Near East as opposed to the Far East, China and whatnot. The American naval historian Alfred Thayer Mahan, he was also an admiral, coined the phrase Middle East. So Arabs, Turks, Persians, Kurds, Azeris make up the largest ethnic groups by population in the region. Major religions include Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Baha'i faith, Mandaism, and Druze. Mandaism, I read it through like 3 times, couldn't really understand it. So no questions about Mandaism. And I'm not, they said, interestingly enough, they did say there's about 5,000 people, the Medians, they're called, who practice Mandaism, who exist today.
You mean the people who are the descendants of Genghis Khan?
Hazards. I guess.
Whatever you
Always a smart kid in the front of the room.
The Azerbaijanis, that they call
maybe. Azerbaijanis. Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, okay. What's that?
I said all the ones
count if they're not part of that? Then they
Well, yeah, no, not necessarily, but Azerbaijan will be in part of this. The Middle East has a hot, arid climate with several major rivers, including the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates. And the land between the Tigris and Euphrates is referred to as Mesopotamia. It's really Iraq now, but so that I just wanted to point that out because we're going to be referring to Mesopotamia quite a bit as we go along. So the Middle East, this is from the CIA fact book on the Middle East, which is actually an excellent website if you're looking for information about different nations. But you can see, Saudi Arabia being the large one, and we'll look how that came to be. Iraq, Iran, which was also Persia, of course, Egypt, and then going up into Turkey. And the Mediterranean is going to play a big role. The Suez Canal, which is built in the second half of the 19th century, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, the Persian Gulf. These are all important places. Okay. Ancient history. So when most of us were going to school, they referred to this area as the Fertile Crescent. Do you remember that phrase when you're taking social studies or history as a student? Which we were taught was the cradle of civilization. Now there were other actually some civilizations developing, for instance in India and other places about the same time. But this is what it was referred to. The Sumerians were the first people in the region to develop a complex social systems that we would call civilization. Starting as far back as 5,000 years before the Common Era, BC, before Christ, now referred to as before the Common Era. The Egyptian civilization formed under the first pharaoh around 3150 BC or BCE, when the Upper and Lower Egypt were united under the first pharaoh. Mesopotamia was the home of many powerful empires, including the Assyrians and Babylonians, who often controlled much of the Middle East, or controlled much of the Middle East. Later, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, controlled the area from the Balkans to the Euphrates. The Macedonian king Philip and his son Alexander the Great conquered Greece, Asia Minor, which is basically Turkey, Egypt, northern Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and India north of the Indus River between 334 and 323. That's when he died, again before the Common Era. His empire, Alexander's empire, combined Greek and Middle Eastern culture and was known as the Hellenistic Age. And upon his death, it was divided into three parts: Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. Okay? The empires fell to Rome during the 1st and 2nd century. Was first century actually before the Common Era, and then that's wrong, and then the 1st century Common Era or AD. Okay, this is just a map showing the region again, but Alexander the Great's empire and the route that he took to conquer all these places. It's really pretty amazing when you think that he did it in about 15 years or so. So that's pretty amazing. Now, medieval Middle East and pre-Islam. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire had conquered much of the Middle East. When Rome was divided east and west by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, should actually be the 5th century, a little mistake there. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, was built on the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. But again, Constantinople, which we know as Constantinople today, or Istanbul today, excuse me, it was Constantinople. The empire encompassed much of Asia Minor, North Africa, the Middle East, along with the Mediterranean Sea, while the Sassanid Empire ruled Persia. During the 7th century, both empires came under increasing pressure from the Arabs and the expanding Islamic civilization. Okay. The Byzantine Empire, which is in the green, you can see pretty almost skirts the Mediterranean Sea, and the Safavid Empire in Persia, which also reached into Mesopotamia, and again, the Tigris and Euphrates River area. Okay, origins of the Israelites. The history of the origin of the Jewish people are different depending on the source. Okay, and I feel like I'm getting into a little controversy here. And my daughter is actually a professor of theology and religion, and her specialty is the Hebrew Bible. And my wife kept on saying, call Dory, but she was in the middle of giving finals and correcting finals, and I didn't want to bother her. So I hope I'm not going to get in too much trouble here. So in approximately 2100 BC, the Hebrew Bible states that the Hebrews left Canaan due to a great famine and moving to Goshen in northern Egypt, where they became enslaved. Then after about 400 years of slavery, Moses led the Exodus back to Canaan. That's in the Bible. Now, modern archaeologists and Egyptologists say there's no evidence of the biblical story, and that the Israelites were indigenous, meaning they originated in Canaan and the Levant. Okay, so whichever story you want to go with, I'm happy with. I was brought up on the Bible part of the story, but anyway, so the Israelite monarchy was established by Saul in around 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, and continued by King David and his son Solomon, with Jerusalem becoming the national and spiritual capital under King David. Eventually a civil war breaks out. There were 12 tribes, and eventually a civil war breaks out between two of the tribes, and northern Israel was conquered, which weakens Israel. Northern Israel being conquered in the 8th century by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians deported some of the Israelites to Mesopotamia. Okay? We're going to be coming back to it. So the diaspora, or diasporas, in the 6th century BC, the Babylonian captivity occurred when the Israelites refused to pay tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you very much, because I practiced it, I listened to it on Google. Say it again.
Nebuchadnezzar?
Nebuchadnezzar, thank you. Nebuchadnezzar. I should know that. Okay, or be able to say it, but my language abilities haven't improved over the few years doing this. Okay, the Jewish-Roman Wars, which were 66 to 135 in the current era, led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple, resulting in the migration of the Jewish people to northern and eastern Europe, with the Ashkenazi, okay, and the Iberian Peninsula with the Sephardic Jews, okay? How am I doing? Okay so far? Okay, good. Now, the two groups have similar cultures and pretty similar histories, and of course persecution greatly, including from Spain being expelled in 1492 and England in 1290. So rather tough histories, but their religion, their ancestry have led to basically a shared identity as Jews right up to the present time. Judy.
Yeah, well, Spain has just said if you can prove your ancestors had to leave that period, you can have Spanish.
Oh, really? Is that recent?
Yeah, maybe a couple of months ago.
Really?
You can prove it.
Yeah.
You can have Spanish identity.
Okay, Judy just said that Spain announced a few months ago that if you can prove that your family was expelled in 1492, they'll give you citizenship.
Wow. One of my relatives, they were Sephardic, but you can't find it to prove it.
Yeah, so you can't use your DNA to prove it?
You have to go back for it.
Yeah, that would be something. I don't know if they'd accept DNA proof or not. Okay. The rise of Islam. Prior to Islam, most of the Arabian Peninsula was sparsely inhabited. I mean, really sparsely inhabited. You'll see by the maps in a minute, by wandering Bedouin tribes. Muhammad lived between 570 and 632, was a Bedouin trader who traveled between Medina and Mecca, two of the very few towns in Western Arabia. And I'll show you a map in a minute. It's really pretty sparsely populated. On one of the trips under a crescent moon in 610, he began receiving divine revelations from the angel Gabriel. When people began accepting his message, Muhammad's message, the authorities in Mecca were not happy, and he became under great pressure and fled or left and moved to Medina in 622, where he converted many more people. This was a very fast-growing religion. And in 630, Muhammad returns to Mecca, which is regarded as the holiest of places in Islam. Now, one of the factors that made Islam so popular was it taught that all people were equal. And the rules are pretty simple to follow. So for people that were poor or downtrodden, it was very, very, it really gave them something to belong to, and it's going to unite a lot of people. The 5 pillars. So one is the declaration of faith. The second is the obligatory prayer. It should be prayers 5 times a day, facing east. Alms or compulsory giving to the poor. Fasting in the month of Ramadan, which we're in now. And a pilgrimage, if possible, to Mecca. In other words, if you're able to do it, a pilgrimage to Mecca. But a schism will develop upon Muhammad's death in 632, a split. Basically, over who will be Muhammad's successor, who will be the next caliph. And there's a split over this. So the Sunnis, which is one group, one major sect, and it is the largest group of Muslims that exists today, they're called Sunnis, believe that the caliph need only be a pious man chosen by consensus. And they chose Abu Bakr as their caliph. The Shia or Shiites believe that the caliph should be a direct descendant of Muhammad, and they backed Ali, who had a very long name, but I shortened it up to Ali, who was assassinated during, leading to the long, often violent history between the two major Islamic sects. And if you see a lot of the violence today, they're actually between Shiites versus Sunnis, etc., back and forth. That goes on. The Quran, who I'm sure you've all heard of, is their holy book containing the word of Allah, their God, or our God. And Sharia, or Islamic law, is God's word revealed, it covers most aspects of a Muslim's life. So that's just kind of the basic for you. So this is a map. The green shades are the Sunni population. The darker the shade is, the more heavily Sunni the population is. The Shia or Shiites shades in purple or pink, and the Abbasid, which is in black, which is basically Oman on the end of the Arabian Peninsula. But there's about 1.5 billion Muslims, and 85% of those are Sunni. And you can see that present-day Iran and Iraq are heavily Shiite. But the problem in Iraq is that their leadership has traditionally been Sunni, and there's been a lot of sectarian violence there because of that. We're going to get into that next month in a lot more detail. 7th and 8th century spread of Islam under Abu Bakr and his successors. The various Bedouin tribes were united, and the entire Arabian Peninsula was ruled as one under the Rashidun Caliphate. The Umayyad Caliphate was the second Islamic caliphate, ruling from 661 to 750 and expanding the Muslim empire to include Persia, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Cordoba, which is basically today's Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. The Umayyad Caliphate was considered too secular. They built these huge palaces. They had large harems. Can you hold up your ring? We have hold up your ring like this and show around. That's a harem ring.
Really? Yes, I belong to a harem.
Yeah.
There are different colored stones on it, meaning where the woman was captured and brought back. The most prized women in the harem were blondes, except occasionally they would capture a redhead.
Oh. The things you learn at the COA. Okay, thank you. The Umayyad Caliphate was, as I said, was considered too secular by many devout Muslims as they lived again in palaces. And they also allowed Christians to hold important offices of power, positions of power throughout the Caliphate, which was unpopular. Many of the people ruled by this caliphate were actually non-Muslims who were allowed to practice their own religion as long as they paid a special tax. Okay, so you could either convert or you could pay a special tax to practice your own religion, which is actually happening to the Jewish people as well in Europe and a lot of places. And this is the Caliphate in 750. Again, pretty much around the southern Mediterranean, North Africa, Iberian Peninsula, as I said, Arabian Peninsula, today's Turkey, up until a little bit of Central Asia, and then Persia. Okay. The Abbasid Caliphate, 750 to 1258. The Abbasid, hoping to gain support from the Shiites, claimed that they were descended from Muhammad's uncle Al-Abbas, which is where Abbasid gets its name from, or it comes from. The Abbasids included more non-Arab Muslims in the national community, the Ummah, than actually Arab Muslims. So when we talk about the Arabs, they're the people that come from the Arabian Peninsula, okay? As opposed to, say, the Persians or North Africans or Egyptians or Turks that we'll get to in a minute. So the Abbasid capital was Baghdad, which we're all familiar with, and was influenced by Persian customs focusing on the arts, science, philosophy, and invention, leading to what is known as the Golden Age of Islam from the 8th to 14th centuries. And they were really phenomenal. They really valued science and learning. Advances in algebra, astronomy, and medicine, including surgery. In the West at this time, the Roman Catholic Church would not allow dissection of bodies, and where it was allowed in Islam, and so they could learn more surgeries, successful surgeries. So that was important. During this time also, the elaborate geometric dome mosques began to dominate Islamic cities. The Abbasids traded extensively outside of the Middle East, sharing their advances with the West as well. Baghdad was captured by the Umayyads, a Shiite Iranian dynasty, in 945, and then the Seljuk Turks from Central Asia in 1055, leading to the end of the political power of the Caliphate over the Islamic Empire. And the Seljuk Turks are going to rule much of the Middle East for about 200 years. I know this is pretty complicated with all the different caliphates and everything, but just, do you get the idea what's going on? Any issues? Okay, good. So, Genghis Khan, the Mongol invasion. And as you know, the Mongols created this huge empire. They're out of Central Asia, and which eventually included China, Russia, Asia Minor, Persia, and the Middle East. It was really it was certainly the largest empire of their time, and one of the largest. I don't know how it compares with the British Empire as far as overall, but it was a large area, and it was very, very important. They also played a big role in communications between the East and Western Europe. They allowed for trade back and forth. Under Hooligan, maybe that's where that comes from, I don't think so. Hooligan Khan, 150,000 Mongols captured Baghdad, and it was a pretty gruesome attack. The Mongols would come up and they'd say, we're going to take you over. Are you willing to surrender, or do you want to die? Okay, if you surrendered, they actually were very good. All they wanted was tribute. They weren't interested in changing your religion, changing your culture, ruling you. They just wanted money. Okay, and that's how they supported themselves, and they take all that money back. The other thing they would take back were tradesmen and craftspeople. People, metal workers or all different types of craftspeople who they would have teach their people different trades and whatnot. But anyway, so they capture Baghdad in 1258. Now, al-Mustasim, I guess, the last caliph, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses in 1258. And you might say, well, that's a strange thing. Well, they actually did that. It was for rulers and for very important people. The Mongols thought it was bad luck to shed a high-born person's blood. But they still wanted to kill him. So what they would do is they'd wrap them in a carpet and ride their horses back and forth over them, killing them, but they wouldn't see the blood. The blood would not be shed. There was actually in Eastern Europe, they took the rulers who refused to capitulate, and they built a big platform, put their captors under the platform, and that then had a huge party on the platform, crushing everybody underneath. So they were very good. So they taught the Mongols. Well, first of all, let me say this: the Ilkhanids, which is the Mongol rule, Iran and Iraq from 1256 to 1336. When the Mongol rule began to fall apart, and small kingdoms were ruled by several competing princes. Basically what was happening was infighting between different grandsons and great-grandsons of Genghis Khan. The Mongols introduced military rule to the Muslims, and the Muslims introduced Islam to the Mongols. And by the 14th century, all four Mongol empires were actually Muslim. Muslims in India. In the year 1000, approximately, Turkish Muslims began raiding into India. And by the late 1100s, a Muslim sultan defeated the Hindu armies and set up his capital at Delhi in India. And it was called the Delhi Sultanate, which would last for 300 years. You think about that. Think about the length of our country. You look at this, 300 years is a pretty significant amount of time. Early on, they destroyed a lot of the Buddhist monasteries, leading to a decline of Buddhism, and many Hindus were killed. But eventually, the Sultanate became more tolerant, and Indian Muslims absorbed a lot of elements from the Hindu culture. And so the Muslims in India were really quite different than the Muslims in the Middle East. In 1526, Babur, a Turkic, Mongol, Persian, and direct descendant of Tamerlane, or Tamar, as he's also referred to, invaded and conquered India, establishing the Mughal dynasty, which again is going to rule for about 300 years. Beyond that, the Safavid Empire. The Safavid dynasty ruled Persia from 1501 to 1722, so a little more than 200 years, and it's considered the beginning of the modern era of Iran. The Safavid Shahs, who were Shiites, ruled over one of the three gunpowder empires, the other two being the Mughal and Ottoman empires. Anybody want to take a guess why they're called the gunpowder empires? They conquered their people with guns and artillery pieces, so they utilized gunpowder. At the height of its power, the Safavid ruled or controlled all of what is now Iran, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Armenia, Eastern Georgia, the North Caucasus, Iraq, Kuwait, and Afghanistan, and parts of Turkey, Syria, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. So they had a very, very large empire. They were an important trade route between the East and the West, and established a very efficient government in this process. They are eventually weakened by attacks from the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and then again from strife within. And this is going to be sort of a key, one of the important trends that we're going to see is that these very, very large Islamic empires have a lot of infighting. And that's going to play a role when we get into World War I with them as well, looking at World War I. Okay, the Ottoman Empire. You can see, long, long-lasting empire, 1299 to 1918. It's founded by Osman I, the Ottoman Empire named after Osman. Ruled much of southeastern Europe, Western Asia, North Africa for about 600 years. After 1356, the Ottomans, who were Muslims, who originated in Central Asia, basically the Seljuk Turks, the remainders of the Seljuk Turks, crossed into Europe, placing the Balkans within its empire. And if you read about the Balkans, they're still mad about it. The Serbians and they're very nationalistic. And a couple of months ago, we looked at the rise. I guess it was maybe last year. We looked at the rise of nationalism and how important nationalism played in the Balkans. And of course, it's going to play a huge part in the start of World War I. In 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror captured Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul, leading to the end of the Byzantine Empire. With its capital in Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire was the center of east-west trade and cultural interactions, resulting in great wealth. So they're a very, very wealthy empire, dealing a lot with the West and Asia. And this is the 14th through the 16th century Ottoman Empire. Again, pretty much you can see when we look at these various maps that they're pretty much the same territory, just going through different empires. Now you might wonder, well, how come the center of the Arabian Peninsula is so nothing's there. It's because nothing's there. Because they had not discovered something yet. Oil, yeah, they had not discovered oil, which was, of course, a game changer. Stagnation of the Ottoman Empire. In the late 15th century, inflation due to Spain importing gold from the Americas greatly increased the cost of maintaining a military of both European monarchies and the Ottoman Empire. So all those galleons coming over from the New World carrying gold spread out throughout Europe, and actually a lot of it was spent in China and Japan and places like that, and it drove the prices way up. There was real inflation, and so all of a sudden, and this is where you see the kings of Europe getting into trouble, needing, new sources of revenue, and at least all sorts of other problems in history, throughout history, but also for the Ottoman Empire. Beginning in 1488, as part of this search for new sources of revenue, right? New trade routes, maritime trade routes are being developed. It also came out of navigational knowledge that had been developed actually by in the Islamic Empire. And they were bypassing the Ottoman trade monopolies. So now the Europeans could go around the Horn of Africa, which is a long trip, of course, and a rough trip, but it could be very, very valuable. Then during the 16th and 17th centuries, a series of wars against Imperial Russia, Austria, and Spain placed pressure on the empire. And these wars illustrated how the Ottoman Empire, through its wealth and its long-standing internal strife, wasn't keeping up technologically, even though they had been the leaders, with the West, especially in military matters, and government we're going to see as a problem as well. The Tassimo period of reform, this is in the Ottoman Empire, and it's pretty small, and I apologize, so I'll read it and point out if you can't read it. After seeing the empire shrink from the outside, interventions and revolts from within, the Sultan's government knew that reforms were needed if the Ottoman Empire was going to survive. So between 1839 and 1876, the Ottomans implemented a series of reforms trying to modernize both their government and their military. Now, one of the things they changed was the millet system. And under the millet system, it really was not a centralized government. They allowed both regional, city, even towns, basically self-rule. They were still part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was self-rule. In fact, interestingly enough, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was actually controlled by Great Britain during this time period. So they issue a bunch of reforms. First of all, they guaranteed Ottoman subjects of their lives, honor, and property. Sort of sounds like the Declaration of Independence, right? An Ottoman currency and finance system was put in, a post office system, a new criminal code. There was a first Ottoman parliament was established, a reorganization of the army and recruitment methods and in terms of enlistment. So I think they reduced the term of enlistment down to 10 years rather than life. They ended slavery and the slave trade. They decriminalized homosexuality. You think about this. This is in the 19th century, right? A Ministry of Healthcare and Education was established, new telegraph and railroad systems, and the Nationality Act providing equal Ottoman citizenship to all citizens regardless of religion or ethnicity. And you might say, well, why are they doing this? Why are they putting in this modernization like this? Well, it was to try to prevent the European country, especially Russia, was using religion as a pretext for invasion. So they said, if we modernize and give people equal rights And again, remember, this is, middle of the 19th century. We can accomplish quite a bit. And the countries, if you remember, the British Empire, they were certainly, under Victoria, were doing a lot of things. This was during the age of revolutions in Europe, right, in the 1850s, and the second, third, how many revolutions in France that were occurring. So this kind of plays along this. So they're trying to, there was a lot of friction between the groups within the empire, and they're trying to reduce the friction to basically grant people more freedoms, more religion, in the hope that outside powers would stay out, would leave them alone, is basically what's happening. Now, in part, these reforms grew out of the Crimean War, which was 1853 to 1856, which saw Russia as a member of the Holy Alliance. Now, if you remember, the Holy Alliance came out of the Congress of Vienna, right? And the Congress of Vienna was the European monarchs, and what was left of the monarchs came together after the defeat of Napoleon. And they wanted to go back to the old ways. They said, we're going to put the kings back in, we're going to put the church, the Catholic Church, back in power of a lot of places. And Alexander I from Russia said, well, we should have an alliance of Christians, basically. Okay, an alliance of Christians, even though they were Russian Orthodox, as opposed to Roman Catholic. So anyway, did I just confuse everybody with that? Did you understand what I was talking about there? I'm sorry, I think I got off on a tangent. A little bit? Okay. Well, anyways, this was the excuse for the Crimean War of Russia. And they wanted to take land away from the Ottomans, which were called the weak man of Europe. Okay. And this is also, the Balkans are breaking away as well. And those are way too many wars to get into and talk about. The Ottomans, with the help of the British, actually defeated, and the French defeated Russia. And the empire wanted to convince Britain and France, again, that its reforms, modernization attempts, were going to make it a more equal player, would make it a stronger country, less open to invasion. The first constitutional period. And this is 1875 to 1876. Again, financial, diplomatic, and internal crises within the Ottoman Empire led leading liberals in the government and members of a secret nationalist. And this is important because nationalism is going to flare up here in a big way. And again, if you remember our talk on nationalism a year or so ago, we talked about the Europeans after Napoleon, the countries were all becoming very nationalistic. So the Young Turks, as they're going to be known, are going to force the passage of the first Ottoman constitution. And the goal of the constitution was to basically create a nation not of Muslims or non-Muslims, but a nation of unified Ottomans or unified Turks. Now, the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks were located in Turkey, okay? So the people outside of Turkey were, of course, not Turks, but they're part of the Ottoman Empire, which is going to be part of the story and part of the problem. Again, it was believed that Christians were fully protected under the law, so foreign intervention, especially from Russia, would cease. But it didn't work. The next year, 1877, Russia attacks using protection, the pretense of protecting the Orthodox Christians, the Eastern Orthodox Christians living within the empire. Russia's actual goal was to regain the land that they'd lost in the Crimean War. Crimea, right? Where you hear Crimea and you go, still going on, right? But anyway, Russia won the war, resulting in Russia claiming several provinces in the Caucasus. Say that for me.
Caucasus.
Thank you, Caucasus, yeah. I also have a very dry throat, which doesn't help me pronounce. But Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia declared independence. Bulgaria became independent after 5 centuries with its capital at Sofia. The occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary. That's a key one to remember, right? Because it started World War I. And Great Britain receives Cyprus, the island of Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean. The second constitutional period, and rebellion by the Young Turks. So, as a result of losing the Russo-Turkish War, the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, in February 1878, suspended the parliament, taking full control of the government. And so he basically is becoming, again, a centralized ruler. In 1908, the Young Turks, many of whom were military leaders, okay, and this is important. So they basically are controlling the military, rebelled and reinstated the Constitution of 1876. And they don't kill the Sultan. It's not a bloody revolution, but they basically just make him a figurehead. They're going to rule, the Young Turks, if you will rule the Ottoman Empire until its dissolution after World War I in 1920. Palestine. I'm going to get a sip of water.
What is Levant?
The Levant is basically Israel and Lebanon. It's that up by the Fertile Crescent, sort of the part of that. So, Palestine is generally defined as the geographic region in the southern Levant between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. It is believed that the name Palestine came from the Philistines, who were an Aegean people more closely related to the Greeks and with no connection ethnically, linguistically, or historically with Arabia. And they conquered in the 12th century the Mediterranean coastal plain. And I get this source from the Jewish Virtual Library, just to give you the source on that one. Situated as a strategic, at a strategic location between Egypt and Syria and Arabia, and as the birthplace of Christianity, Judaism, and the region has a long tumultuous history as a crossroads of religion, culture, commerce, and politics.
I thought the Romans used the name Palestine, pure Palestine.
Well, I think they did, yeah. Yeah, I think they did.
It's based on Philistines, but the Romans
Coined the phrase, Palestine, okay.
Wow. So they aren't really Arabs?
No, they're not.
They're not Arabs?
No, they're Greeks.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, Greeks, Macedonians from way, way, way back. See, these were all tribes when you go way, way back, and who are being pushed out by different other groups and moving around. It's very tribal. Okay. History of Palestine. So some of this is kind of a review of what we've talked about, but Palestine is going to be such an important place for today, and then also for part 2 of the Middle East history. I thought we'd spend some time looking at it. So the classical age, Palestine was conquered by Alexander the Great during the 330s BC, and then by the Romans in the 1st century, followed by the Byzantines in 628. During the Middle Ages, they're of course under the Islamic Caliphate, and took Palestine from the Byzantines and renamed it Jund Philistin. In 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon, leading the First Crusade, captured Palestine and established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted a little under 100 years. And in 1187, when the Sunni Muslim Saladin, and a famous guy in history, you've probably heard of Saladin, once again captured Jerusalem and most of Palestine. Now there's a whole bunch of crusades. But the other important crusade is the Third Crusade, in 1189, led by Frederick Barbarossa of the German states, Philip Augusta of France, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. They failed to capture Jerusalem, but persuaded Saladin to grant safe passage to Christian pilgrims. So pilgrims could actually go to Jerusalem and visit the Holy Land after this time period. Subsequent crusades failed to establish a Christian rule of the Holy Land, and by 1291, the Ottoman Turks completely controlled Palestine until after World War I, or actually during World War I. Who wants a cookie? Okay, so my wife, watch the cup there. My wife did research, and these are Syrian.
Shortbread.
What's the name?
Gray bar.
Syrian gray bar cookies, which are shortbread cookies, with a pistachio nut on them, and she shaped each one into either supposed to be a fish or, this is going to drive Charles nuts, half affinity. I don't think there's half of infinity. I don't think that's possible, is there, Charles?
It's a symbol.
It's a symbol. It's a symbol of the infinity symbol, not infinity itself. Yeah. I said, as soon as she told me, I said, oh, Charles will go crazy when he hears half of infinity. It's not logical, is it, Charles?
So the pistachio nuts didn't stick, so if you're missing a pistachio nut, look on the tray.
Yeah.
They're not as sweet. They don't make their cookies sweet. So there's actually only like a half a cup of sugar, but there's lots of butter.
Yeah, very buttery, yeah. So please, help yourselves. We'll take about a 10-minute break. Okay. We're going to now go into World War I, which is going to have a huge impact, of course, not only on Europe, America as well, but really on the Middle East will have a huge impact, and it's going to bring, of course, the end of the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire prior to World War I. So we're basically looking in the early 20th century here. Was a shadow of its former self. There was little central control, with real political power and institutional organization being held at the city, town, and clan levels. Okay, so they did put in some reforms, but they weren't all that effective. The Sultan was merely a figurehead, with the Young Turks filling the void. The Young Turks were nationalists without a nation. Okay, and I should have put that in quotes because that's actually not my phrase. And I'll share the source at the end. I'll share the source which I've used for this talk. As late as 1913, Britain believed that the Jews were in control of the Ottoman Empire. And Judy's laughing hysterically over here. And it does sound kind of funny, but it shows the British government how they really didn't understand the Middle East. And you say, well, that's crazy. They controlled Egypt. They were in Palestine. There were all these different places in India. But where did they live? They lived in their compounds, right? They had their own country clubs, their own social clubs, and they didn't have much interaction with the people, except for the people, the natives, if you will, were brought to England to be educated in England, and they became the colonial government leaders, and those are the ones they interacted with. So they really didn't understand the people or even the politics. And that's going to play a major role in this. So British interest and influence on the Middle East prior to World War I. So David Lloyd George, okay? He's going to become prime minister during the war in 1916, but he had actually a long history, a long interest in establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He was raised in Manchester, not New Hampshire, but England. which is home to a large Jewish population, and he was brought up in the nonconformist faith. Now, the Anglican Church is the Church of England. The nonconformists were whom? They were basically the Puritans, right? And and Zionism in this faith was really went back to the days of the Mayflower, not the Mayflower itself, but the days of the Mayflower. So it was long held by the nonconformists that Zionism, the Holy Land, should be returned. Lloyd George was introduced to Zionism in 1903 when he was a lawyer representing Dr. Theodore Herzl, who was the founder of the Zionist movement. He was a journalist and an intellectual, and he founded the movement in 1896 after the Dreyfus case in France. Dreyfus was a military officer who was Jewish, who basically through anti-Semitism was treated very unfairly. Herzl saw this, he covered the story, and basically said, we've got to do something about this. In 1903, Arthur Balfour was the prime minister, okay? And he supported the idea of political Zionism, basically a Jewish state, because it fit with the idea of nationalism, which was the hot concept of this period. Okay, nationalism seemed to be the answer to a lot of problems. In other words, you get people together and you form strong countries. This is moving away, of course, from monarchies and things like that. And of course, we're going to know that nationalism is going to be really one of the major causes of World War I, World War II, but at this time it seemed as a real positive thing. And nationalism can be great as long as it's not ultra-nationalism. Okay, the Zionist movement falters. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, a majority of Jews lived in the Pale settlement in Western Imperial Russia, which was also part of Poland. And these Jews suffered terribly under what was called the pogroms. And the pogroms were officially sponsored murder, robbery, burnings, just terrible, terrible anti-Semitism, prejudice. I used to show my students the film Fievel. Fievel? It's a cartoon. Okay, and it was about the mice. Fievel the mouse, yeah. I forget, Fievel the Muskowitz or something. Fievel Muskowitz was his name.
But the book is with an M, I forgot the name.
Yeah, but
It's like cartoons, but it wasn't.
yeah, it was actually part of the trilogy that included Schindler's List.
Yeah.
But the first one was actually a cartoon. But it showed really well the pogroms in Russia. Yeah. So, and by 1903, by 1903, the Zionist movement had split over where to locate the new Jewish homeland. Okay, so there were basically two proposals being examined. One was East Africa, and the other was on the Sinai Peninsula, which is basically, between Egypt and Palestine. And I suppose East Africa was being looked at because it's going to be pretty hard to go back to Palestine, so it's an area we can maybe go to. So that's what actually David Lloyd George was representing Herzl about, was that argument or conflict within the organization. But Herzl passes away in 1904 at the age of 40. Balfour is voted out of office, and the Zionist movement in Britain falters. It loses momentum and traction in the government. Ottoman Empire during World War I. So in 1914, the Young Turks, who are basically running the government, the Ottoman Empire, they want to form an alliance. They're afraid, again, they're still afraid of Russia. Remember, they were defeated by Russia in 1877, 1878. The Austrians had moved into the Balkans. And so they're sending diplomats to Britain, France, and Germany. Okay? And Britain and France looked at the Ottoman Empire as like, why do we want these guys? You know, they're weak, they're disorganized, what do they have to offer? We don't really need them. So they weren't really responding. And actually, the German foreign minister said the same thing, except for then Kaiser Wilhelm II heard about it and said, no, this will be good. This will be good. We want them. And so he forces, or he tells his government to sign an alliance with the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks. The British believe that the war, once Turkey joins with Germany, will be the downfall, which in fact it actually was, and that it would rightfully, the Middle East, or the Ottoman Empire, should rightfully be controlled by France and Great Britain, and perhaps Russia. This is before the revolution. And they say they can't govern themselves. It's going to be at least 50 years before the Ottoman Empire will be able to have self-rule. Now, in 1916, they signed an agreement called the Sykes. This is by Mark Sykes, who was a young guy, a young British guy, but it was a specialist in the Middle East. And Picot, thank you, was signed between, of course, Great Britain and France, where they agreed to partition the Ottoman Empire after the war. And under this agreement, Britain would be allocated Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and France would control southern Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. Yes?
I read that they took the map.
Yeah.
They decided you get this, you get this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just drew a
Drew a
line.
line.
They just drew a line. Now, the crazy thing was, Mark Sykes was pretty much working on his own. He was not a high-level guy at all. So let's get into this a little bit more. I'll show you who the high-level people were. Britain schemes to divide the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So World War I quickly, of course, as we know, we looked at World War I, develops into a stalemate on the Western Front in 1914, early 1915. Britain believed that the way to win the war was through the Ottoman Empire, the weak player of the Central Powers. In October 1914, Lord Kitchener. Now, Lord Kitchener was basically the Douglas MacArthur for our World War II generation, for World War I in Britain. They thought that he was a hero of the Boer War. He'd been in the Middle East for years and years and years. Almost like MacArthur, he really had spent very little time in Britain in his adult life. MacArthur spent most of his time in Asia during his career. So it was really kind of in a way similar. But he becomes basically directing the British war effort. And so Kitchener and Sir Edward Grey, who was the foreign minister of the Foreign Office, sent a telegram to Sharif Hussein, who was the emir of Mecca. Okay? Now this is where it's going to get intrigue and get important. Remember that name, Sharif Hussein. We're going to be coming back to him several times. The message promised that if Hussein declared Arab independence from the Ottoman Empire, Britain would protect Arabia from foreign invasion. So they send the telegraph, to Egypt, where there are British officials to translate it into Arabic and to present it to Sharif Hussein. Well, when they translated it as, if you rebel against the Ottoman Empire, we will ensure your independence. You should all go, ah. Come on, let's hear it. Ah. Come on, guys. Ah. Okay. All right. Thank you. You got to keep you with me here. Okay. Now, they believe that the Arabians, the Arab people, were one people, which they aren't at all. They're all these separate tribes and whatnot. And that they would follow Hussein, the Emir Hussein, who was the leader of Mecca, which is, Islam's holiest city. So they said, well, if we get the leader of Mecca behind us, all of them will, all the Muslims will follow us. So Emir Hussein, who's getting a lot of money in this process, called for a jihad, or holy war, against the Young Turks and the Ottoman Empire. But it failed when none of the soldiers revolted. So they thought, if he calls a jihad, all the soldiers are just going to, Ottoman soldiers are going to quit, turn against their government. We'll have taken the Ottoman Empire out of the war. This will be great. Didn't happen. He had something like 1,400 soldiers with him. I mean, it was a really small group. The British, who controlled Egypt, as I'd mentioned before, wanted to control the Arabian Peninsula to protect the Suez Canal, which was, of course, the route to India and beyond without having to go around the Horn of Africa. So in 1915, a British interdepartmental committee laid out Britain's post-war goals. And it was Russia this is a study group in 1915, said that Russia would receive Constantinople, France would receive Syria, and Britain would obtain Palestine and the entire Arabian Peninsula. This was their idea, okay, in 1915. Okay, now, this is World War I, but I just want to point out, if I get on stage without having the mic blow me off the stage. Now, of course, these are the Central Powers here, okay? The Allied powers, mainly Russia, France, and Great Britain, and Italy. But right here, this is key right here. Anybody tell me what this is called? Connects the Aegean with the Black Sea, the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, and they're straits, which mean it's very narrow in places. Some places like 12 miles wide, okay? So, and the Ottoman Empire controlled the European side plus the Asian side, with Constantinople being their capital. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay. Gallipoli. Who's seen the movie Gallipoli? Oh, yeah. That's a wonderful movie. Did it win Best Picture?
I don't think so.
No, but it was that capable. It's a
Yeah, you can get it on a DVD.
Yeah, you can definitely get it on DVD. And it's basically, it's about the battle, but I'll speak more to it in a minute. So 1915, 1916, Britain attacks the Ottomans at Gallipoli, which is on the Bosphorus Dardanelle. The attack ultimately fails, costing millions of pounds, thousands of lives, and great humiliation, plus Winston Churchill's job. He was the first Lord of the Admiralty. Now, he got the blame, he took the blame, it really was not fully his blame, okay? He was part of, obviously as the first Lord of the Admiralty, part of figuring out what the strategy was going to be to break the stalemate. And so he was in favor, in fact, of attacking the Ottoman Empire, basically near Constantinople, running up through the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and sort of coming in at, hooking up with the Russians and then attacking the Germans from behind. But Kitchener got involved, okay, and he at first was not on board. So Kitchener says, okay, you guys want to do it, you can do it, but it's just going to be a naval attack. And the military and Churchill, well, it can't just be a naval attack. He goes, well, if you want to do it, it's got to be a naval attack. Then we'll think about sending the army in. Well, as it turns out, the Ottomans had a very, very, very small number of troops along guarding the strait. They had some forts, but in some of the forts they had like 20 guys. They had enough ammunition to fire for about 20 minutes. Okay, so there was almost no ammunition. They had planted a line of mines across the straits, but not many of them. So the British Navy sails in. Of course, they hit a couple of mines. A couple of ships are, sunk. They spin around saying, we're not doing this, and they go back out. And so then Kitchener says, well, we really should do this, and plus it's going to look bad if we're going to lose to the Ottomans. Come on. And so he says, well, maybe we'll send the army in too, but we'll send in the troops from Australia and New Zealand. Let them do it. And then if you see the movie Gallipoli, you'll understand this. And it's about a couple of guys who run track. Okay. Well, in the meantime, the Germans send a couple of German generals in to set up proper defenses, get more troops in, get more artillery in, build trenches on top, because it comes from the water and then goes up steep cliffs almost. Yeah, what's that?
They never got off the beach.
Yeah, they basically never get off the beach. So, long story short, they go back in with these troops, land them on the beach, who are under enemy fire essentially the whole time they're there, and then told to go over the top and just rush up the hill, and thousands and thousands of them die. So it's a disaster. So Churchill is so upset, he volunteers as an officer to go to the Western Front, which he survives. If you read his autobiography, he knew he was going to survive because he knew he was destined for greatness. And in the Boer War and World War I at the trenches, he'd stand up and yell at the enemy and expose, not expose himself, that doesn't sound right, but expose himself to harm, okay? And, oh man. And so anyway, so that fails. So then in 1917, they say, well, let's have a Palestinian offensive. Let's take Palestine away from the Ottomans. And again, they want to protect the Suez Canal. Even if we lose the war in 1917, they weren't sure they were going to win this war on the West. I don't think they thought they were ever going to be invaded or it was going to be catastrophic, but they thought that it might be a negotiated end to the war, and they didn't want to end up losing Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, because India, right, was the pearl of the British Empire, is where they got most of their money. I shut that phone off. I apologize. Okay. It's a good thing the principal's not here, I'd get fired.
When was the Suez Canal completed?
It was completed in like the 1870s or so. It was built by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who built a very successful 110 miles through the desert. So then when they wanted to build the Panama Canal, he puts together a company, goes, oh, we'll build the Panama Canal. It's only 50 miles long, piece of cake.
They failed.
And they failed badly because of yellow fever and malaria. And then it's not until they figure out the source or the cause of yellow fever that Teddy Roosevelt says, oh, let's take it over. And they go in and they get rid of all the still water and whatnot. And we successfully built it, and it opens in 1914. So I think it was 1860s or 70s, right in that period anyway. The United States declares war, of course, in April 1917, but we had to gear up and get our troops there, so we're not going to have a big impact until 1918. The Balfour Declaration, really important, okay? Pay attention, this is going to be on the test, okay? So, David Lloyd George, as we know, favored Zionism. He grew up believing in Zionism, and he became prime minister in 1916, and guess who becomes the foreign secretary, Arthur Balfour, who was the prime minister in 1903, okay, who had supported it. So Balfour sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, okay, and Lord Rothschild was a financier, a banker, also a Jewish, he was Jewish, and a strong Zionist, believer in Zionism. So the letter gets published on November 9th, 1917 by the Times of London, and it becomes known as the Balfour Declaration, which stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, for all the world to read. See. Now, the Balfour Declaration was partially aimed at Russian Jews. This is how out of touch these guys actually were, who it was hoped would pressure Russia, Judy's laughing down here, pressure Russia into remaining in the war. Because what happened in October? The revolution, the Bolsheviks, Lenin. Okay, and of course, he gets off the train in 1917 at Moscow Station, and what does he say? Loudly, peace, bread, and land. That's the first thing he says as he steps off the train. Peace, we're going to get the heck out of World War I, because they were just getting clobbered in World War I. Their Tsar Nicholas II was the commander, and it was not good. Arabs and Armenian leaders, actually supported the Zionist movement in 1917, hoping that an independent Jewish homeland would strengthen their own cause for independence. Okay? Now this might come as a real surprise, but they're actually saying, no, this is a good idea, because they're fighting for independence, because they'd been under rule for a long time. The declaration called for protecting the civil and religious rights of the Palestinian Arabs, who compose the vast majority of the Palestinian population. Now, it gets interesting. The term homeland was used instead of the term Jewish state. Okay? To be intentionally vague so as to not arouse conflict with the promises made earlier regarding an independent Arabia to the Arab Emir Hussein. So what have the British done? They've told the Arabs, you can have an Arab state in Palestine, and they said to the Jewish people, you can have a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Okay? Now, the declaration was vague when it stated in Palestine, not clearly specifying whether the homeland would comprise just a portion of Palestine or all of Palestine. Okay, go on. Okay, American reaction to Balfour. So prior to the Balfour Declaration, the American Zionist movement was very small and only had about 12,000 members. Now, Louis Brandeis, by the way, became the leader of the Zionist movement in 1914. He becomes a justice in the Supreme Court in 1916, so this is just before, but he's already really well known. Most Jews had immigrated to the United States, wanted to assimilate quickly as possible and stay clear of any foreign taint. And that's not my words, I'm using it as a quote. And it's interesting when I read that, because growing up, I had Jewish friends, and they typically did not have Jewish names. And I remember having a conversation, and they said their parents and grandparents who had immigrated didn't want any connection with Europe and wanted to Americanize as quickly. They didn't give up their religion. They were still, practicing Jews, but they didn't want to be identified as Europeans who had immigrated. They wanted to assimilate into the culture of the country. Okay? And so when I read this, I said, that makes sense. This connects with what what I had heard. Now, after the Balfour Declaration, Zionism was viewed as being patriotic because it was viewed as helping to defeat the Central Powers, and therefore would Jewish Americans joined in great numbers and reached 175,000 by 1919. British military expedition. Now, when Emir Hussein's jihad against the Ottoman Empire failed to materialize, Britain launched a military invasion of Mesopotamia through the Persian Gulf. It was a sea landing through the Persian Gulf, capturing Baghdad in March of 1917. On December 11th, 1917, British forces entered Jerusalem, and in early 1918, they launched the Sinai-Palestine offensive against the remaining Ottoman forces. There weren't a lot of Ottoman forces in Palestine or on the Arabian Peninsula at this point. And so it wasn't horrendous fighting. Now, Prince Faisal, okay, is a name you've probably heard of. He was supported by the British, and he was the son, he supported the British and was supported by, let me say this clearly. Stop, get my brain going here. The British plan, okay, was supported by Faisal, okay? And Prince Faisal, who was the son of Emir Hussein of Mecca, in setting up a Jewish settlement in what he called the biblical Palestine, which was west of the Jordan River. So it wasn't all of Palestine, it was a section of Palestine, okay? The British had decided that Faisal was better to work with than his father because his father didn't follow their directions very well. For one, he would not even allow them to come to Mecca to have meetings because non-Muslims are not allowed to enter Mecca. In January 1918, Britain sent a Zionist commission to Jerusalem to work out the details for the immigration of Jews to Palestine. Okay, and the Muslims and Christians living in Jerusalem were not enthusiastic about this at all because they saw that they could be displaced, they were going to lose power, they're going to share the limited resources. Palestine, or of course Israel today, Palestine was not like Israel today. It was a dry place for the most part. And of course, it's really been developed by the Israelis with lots of farming and gardens. And they were actually afraid of being able to feed themselves if a whole group of people came in. End of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I'm not really doing much on the end of the war because we've done that already, so I assume we all remember how World War I ended, but the armistice of Mudros, signed on October 30th, 1918, ended the hostilities between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies. So this is, not quite 2 weeks before November 11th, 1918, right? When the Germans signed the armistice. In the agreement, the empire gave up its garrisons, as the Ottoman Empire gives up its garrisons outside of Anatolia. Anatolia is another name for Turkey, okay? As well as forts controlling the Straits of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus. Constantinople was occupied by the British, French, and Italian forces, which would lead to the partition of the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10th, 1920, dismembered the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of its partition. In the terms, the empire gave up all of its non-Turkish territory, and the administration of its government was taken over by the Allies. Okay, so we're seeing that the Ottoman Empire is getting basically wiped out. Now, this is a person that you probably most of you have heard of, Mustafa Kemal, who was known as Ataturk, which I used to tell my students is the best name in history. Come on, Ataturk! It's like Attaboy, Ataturk. No? It's not reaching you. What it actually means, Ada is father and Turk is Turkey. So father of the Turks is what it means. But he's a young Turk, not so young here, but will play a major role, of course. The Turkish War for Independence. So we've had some treaties signed, but the Ottoman Parliament never signed the treaty. Okay, and in May 1919, Turkish nationalists began fighting the Allies for their independence. So even though the country itself has, the leadership has given up, the nationalists are saying, no, we're not giving up, and Ataturk is going to be one of these guys. He leads the independence movement and the war and successfully defeats the few Allied forces. Now, I say few Allied forces. There were some French and there were some British, but there were a lot of supplemental, if you want to call them forces, not a lot of people. Remember, what had just ended? World War I, 25% of the French population, men gone. Britain suffered terribly. America suffered terribly. Nobody wanted war at this point. Nobody wants war. So they don't give it the effort that they could have given it. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, ending the war. This is the Turkish War for Independence, leading to the independent Republic of Turkey, which is the country that it is today. Ataturk immediately institutes a series of political, legal, religious, cultural, social, and economic policy changes that were designed to convert the new Republic of Turkey into a secular, modern nation state. Now, if you've been following history, recent history, it's trying to decide which way it's going to go. Some people want to take it more, make it more of a Islamic religious state. The League of Nations mandates, okay? Very, very important. So the mandates, following the signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918, ending the fighting in World War I, the victorious Allied nations met at Versailles to hammer out the terms of a peace treaty. 117 Zionists actually attended, not as official, representatives, but as representatives of Zionism. And actually other groups attended as well. If you remember, last month we talked about Korea, right? And Korean representatives went to Versailles as well, basically begging for independence.
Ho Chi Minh went too.
Yeah, that's right. Ho Chi Minh went. So this was, a lot of people went. And the reason a lot of them went was actually because of President Wilson, because in the 14 points, one of his points was that countries should retain their own sovereignty. He was against colonialism. He wanted to see the end of colonialism, wanted independent countries. So as part of the agreement, Wilson successfully pushed the passage of the League of Nations, which of course the United States never signs, which would become the first international governmental organization. On June 28, 1919, Article 22 of the League of Nations created the mandate system. Now, a League of Nations mandate was a legal status for certain territories transferred from the control of one country to another. It's different than a colony, okay? Under a colony, the controlling country would receive basically the benefits of the colony, and typically that was raw materials and labor coming to the mother country, and then in turning that into finished goods, okay, and then selling it back to the colony at a profit, okay, and so the money always flowed to the mother country. Well, this is different, and we're going to see why. The mandates were both a treaty and a constitution with agreed upon terms to be administered on behalf of the League of Nations. Now, the mandates contain minority rights clauses that provided for the rights of petition and adjudication by International Court in The Hague. The mandates contained two governing principles for the mandates. One was non-annexation. In other words, you could not take them over, make them a colony, or make them permanently part of your country. And the second was its administration as a sacred trust of civilization. And that's directly taken from Article 22, to develop the territory for the benefit of its native people. Okay? So everybody understands the difference between a mandate and a colony.
Right.
In theory. Okay. And the in theory part's actually important. Okay. The French Mandate. So on September 22nd, 1923, the League of Nations assigned France the mandate for Syria, which included modern-day Lebanon and Alexandretta, which is a large southern Turkish city on the Mediterranean coast. So it's in southern Turkey on the Med. All of the Syrian sects, the French subdivided the mandate into 6 states based roughly on the sectarian makeup on the ground. Kind of makes sense, right? So they're saying we're going to set up these states based on who's living in the area. Okay? It's better than what they did in Yugoslavia, though that was not a mandate, but where they took all these people who hated each other and put them together. Now, all the Syrian sects, because remember this was Syria, this was all Syria, though it did have these other parts, were hostile to the French mandate and its subdivisions. So the Syrians themselves were not happy about this, and it took the French several years of fighting to quell all the insurgencies that broke out. Now, the French created the state of Greater Lebanon, which will become Lebanon, or the Lebanese Republic, in 1926, with its capital as Beirut. But the reason they did it was there were a lot of Christians in Beirut and in Lebanon, and they did it as a safe haven. I didn't finish haven, as a safe haven for Christians. Okay, so it became actually the only Christian country majority Christian country in the Middle East. Now, many Muslims in Lebanon were, of course, opposed to the creation of Greater Lebanon and demanded reunification with Syria. And eventually, there's going to be fighting that breaks out in 1958. So, a long time in, armed conflict. French mandate, just to see the different states. So you had Aleppo, Damascus, Greater Lebanon. Israel or Palestine is below Greater Lebanon. The Alawite state, Alexandretta, up in the left-hand corner, and the Druze state, Jabal al-Druze state, down in the lower right corner. So that's how they divided up Syria. Of course, I don't know why the Syrians were upset with this. Go ahead. French rule of the mandate. So how did they rule it? The French gave different ethnic and religious groups their own land, okay, which sounded like a good idea, with the hope of fragmenting the various groups in the region so that the local population would not focus on nationalism and begin fighting against French colonial rule. Okay, so they set up these different areas basically to separate them, to keep them from coming together as a force and going against France. Think of Vietnam, right? Same thing's happening in Vietnam here at the same time with the French. The administration of the state governments was heavily dominated by the French. There were local authorities, Syrian authorities, but they were given very little power, and they basically couldn't do anything independently without the approval of the French. What they did decide on could be easily overruled by the French officials. And the French basically did everything in their power to prevent the people from developing self-sufficient governing bodies. So they kept them weak, they kept them separated as much as they could. This French mandate lasts until 1943, with Lebanon and Syria emerging as two independent nations. So the rest of Syria comes back together. And of course, we know what's going on in Syria recently. It's been awful. Okay, and they left in 1946. The last troops pulled out in 1946. Okay, let's switch over to the British mandate. The British were basically awarded 3 mandate territories. The first mandate was Iraq, and actually Transjordan, as it was called. Now, Iraq, they placed Faisal bin Hussein as king, so he became King Faisal, and Abdullah bin Hussein as king of Transjordan. They were both sons of the Emir of Mecca, Hussein of Mecca. Okay? Now, the second mandate is Palestine, and the British kept control of that themselves. They didn't appoint a local king or ruler there. They said, we're gonna run Palestine ourselves. And the third mandate, making up most of the Arabian Peninsula, became Saudi Arabia. And throughout this whole process, they had a strong ally, Arab ally by the name of Ibn Saud, and they named him as the first king of Saudi Arabia, which of course, again, we see in the news a lot, and they're so important to that area now. Mandate for Palestine. So, the mandate for Palestine was a Class A League of Nations mandate. They had 3 classes, A, B, and C. All the French mandates and the British mandates were all Class A mandates. The mandates in Africa, which were taken away from the Germans, their former colonies, were Class B and C mandates. So the Class A mandates were provided to provide governance for the territories that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries, okay, where the Germans had not controlled Africa for centuries. It was a pretty recent thing, until they could stand alone, stand on their own 2 feet, if you will. The Palestinian Arabs used this clause throughout the period of mandate to call for an independent Arab state. They kept on saying, okay, we're ready to stand on our own. You know, it says in the mandate that you're only going to keep the mandate until we can stand on our own 2 feet. So this is going to be a strong argument. Now, the Palestinian mandate, of course, is complicated for why we said before. First, the promise to Emir Hussein for an independent Arab nation in return for the Arab uprising, who, by the way, was supported by T.E. Lawrence, who is Lawrence of Arabia, who actually, after doing some research, was kind of a nut job. He'd just go back to the bridge and say, oh, we've accomplished this, and we're doing this, none of which was true. He was becoming really closer with the Arabs. It was very interesting. The Balfour Declaration, of course, was in opposition to that other promise supporting a Jewish homeland. So, on August 22nd, 1922, the Constitution of Mandatory Palestine was codified, was put into writing, providing for the executive authority to be placed under the British High Commission for Palestine, which are British officials, an elected legislative council, which would have been local, and a civil and religious court system. Now this is interesting. I thought this was interesting, so I put it in. What was the population in Palestine at this time? How would it break down? They took a census in 1922, and the Muslims were by far this is by religion, were by far the greatest number, with just under 600,000 Muslims. There were 84,000 Jews, 73,000 Christians. This was in 1922, and approximately 8,000 people divided up between 4 other religions: the Druze, the Baha'i faith, the other religions. Just 8,000 others. Article 7 of the mandate stated, "The administration of Palestine shall be responsible for enacting a nationality law. There shall be included in this law provisions framed so as to facilitate the acquisition of Palestinian citizenship by Jews who take up their permanent residence in Palestine." So this is sort of putting into law Zionism, and basically say, if Jewish people move to Palestine, they will become citizens. They will gain full Palestinian citizenship. And by 1938, 500,000 Jews had immigrated to Palestine. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, conclusion. And then we can have our little discussion here. As was true for Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the Middle East was a conundrum, was a problem they couldn't quite understand or figure out to the Western empires. The Ottoman sultans had discovered over time that the Middle East was made up of different ethnic and religious groups, making it extremely difficult to rule. To try to come up with a policy for all these different groups to make everybody happy, or at least have them accept it, was very, very difficult. The Europeans, who had long ignored the Middle East as a sort of backwater that wasn't really worth much interest, discovered during World War I how vital it was as a route to India and as a buffer to Russian expansion. They're really concerned about Russian expansion at this point. The Europeans, keeping in character, believed that colonial leadership was just what was needed to ensure the region would become both a military and economic asset. So you've got the leadership in Britain sort of firmly in the 19th century saying, we need to expand the British Empire, right? And that's not what was going to happen here. They did it, but it's not going to do it well. The Europeans had a lot to learn. So the Treaty of Versailles and the mandates was a peace to end all peace. Okay? Now, this was a bestseller in the New York Times list from 1989. David Fromkin is the author. Really well done. This was my Bible, and Dr. Charles Davis, my good friend, when he found out I was doing this topic, delivered this to my house the next day, okay, which provided me with a lot of information. So, Charlie, thank you very much. So, A Peace to End All Peace by Fromkin is the source for a lot of what I had. Okay, so I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. Which event do you believe was the most important? And again, we're going to and what I'm asking you to do is up to 1925, okay? And as I said earlier, I didn't want to have the discussion be about today, though some of the things that happened back then are definitely going to have an influence on today. But I really did this so you could understand the progression, to understand where we are today. We're going to pick up next month. I think it's May 13th. It's again the second Thursday, June 13th. Thank you, June 13th, second Thursday. This is Thursday, second Thursday, 1:30 to 3:30, right here. Part 2, which we'll pick up in 1930 when independence starts to happen, and then go on from there. So again, there are people who have limited hearing, and so if you would be willing to use the microphone, I'd really appreciate it for the people who can't hear. And Jan, do you want to pass the mic around? So what are our choices for the event? It can go from way, way back to 1925. Not all at once. There's no wrong answer. See, the beauty of an essential question is there's really no wrong answer, as long as you can give a bit of evidence.
Well, maybe we're just,
She's off in a hurry, so there must be some. Oh, thank you, sir. I didn't see whose hand was raised. Speak right into it so they can.
World War I, because World War I threw everything into a blender and all this crap came out at the end.
Okay. Can you just give me a little evidence for that?
All you have to do is look at the modern Middle East. I mean, the British messed up Palestine, the French screwed up Lebanon and Syria, and they didn't leave. And in World War II, they were fighting over the same territory with the Nazis. I mean, the whole thing is just, it was a big mess, and it was even a bigger mess in World War II.
Yeah. Yeah. Good evidence. No, you're absolutely right. And it's great. Someone else. Sir? Yeah, Jan.
Well, I would have to say the birth of Muhammad. If he hadn't been born, none of this would have happened.
Okay, so if you didn't hear, he's saying the birth of Muhammad and the rise of Islam, you're saying, is the cause for all these problems?
No, that's not what the question is. Which event do you believe was the most important in the history of the Middle East?
Okay, yeah, most important. And so in your evidence was a lot of problems came out of the birth of Muhammad, is that what you're saying?
Problems as well as advances. I mean, it just really stirred the whole melting pot.
Okay, both positive and perhaps, yeah. Well, I'm not disagreeing with you. I was just trying to get a little. So it's not pejorative. You're just saying that that the birth of the Islamic empires, if you will, had a lot of positive, the sciences, and then there's been problems within. Yeah.
I think it's the talk of nationalism and yet the lack of regard for the ethnic divisions.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that, and Iraq, of course, is a good example is a perfect example. Israel is a perfect example of that. So that's a good point. So nationalism, but then not really considering all the people that are there and giving people their rights, is what you're saying, basically. Good point, Jim.
I think the League of Nations, the whole idea that a group of nations could come up with rules and mandates and how to solve relations between countries was important to the history of the Middle East. The idea, we never joined, but that was the tenor of the time after World War I, as exemplified by Wilson. That was, I think, the idea that was important to the mess we're in now.
Yeah, no, well, the League of Nations, the mandate's coming out, but then you can expand that to what? The League of Nations came out of Versailles. Yes. Okay, and so look what one of the things they did was try to combine these groups, going back to Dr. Davis's point of, again, the Balkans. Right? They create Yugoslavia made out of both three different religious groups, but more importantly, the ethnic groups that somebody else had mentioned that just didn't work well together. Yugoslavia was a pretty modern country, okay? And then 1990, communism basically fails, and what happens? They start killing each other. I mean, it's terrible, terrible.
Tito sort of kept it together.
Well, yeah, no, but even after Tito, they became pretty progressive for again, it was a non-aligned, communist or really socialist state.
I was reading that in World War II, if flyers, when they were shot, if they were shot down over there, it depended on who grabbed them.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure.
If like Tito's people would take them, they'd be okay.
Yeah.
But the other ones, they headed them over to the Germans.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
it was a messy place.
Yeah, no, it was a messy place. Czechoslovakia,
Same thing.
Czech Republic and Slovakia, same thing. So your point's very, very well taken. Yeah, that's an important. Versailles was, but who made the decisions at Versailles?
We weren't there.
Basically the French and the British.
They divided it up.
Yeah, Wilson was there, greeted as the conquering hero, right? But they wouldn't listen to him. And Orlando was there representing the Italians, but again, didn't really have much say. And so everybody comes out disgruntled, and as I said, just not many years later, we're in World War II, which was...
Do you have a thought about the most important? I mean, it's all important. I mean, all those empires.
I have one.
Yeah, we have a young lady here, then I'll give my two.
I think all those countries were right in the fact that they didn't want the Russians to, get down there and try to, take more land. I think they were unifying all the separate, the Palestinians, all of them were against, at least unified against the Russians coming down and with expansion. That might be a point.
Yeah, no, it is a point. So that's these decisions don't happen in a vacuum, right? They're trying to prevent the Russians. There was something called the Great Game. Have you ever heard of that? The Great Game was actually competition for Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, basically, especially Afghanistan, between the French, the British, and the Russians. And there's a great book that's been out 25 years or so, but it's called The Great Game. If you're interested in this topic, it's a very, especially Afghanistan, which should be a lesson kind of for the United States. Nobody won in the Great Game, and then the Russians, of course, go in, which we had talked about earlier in the year, into Afghanistan, can't win, and it's next to impossible. Again, because people see Afghanistan as, it's Afghanistan, it's a country. Well, there are all these different groups within Afghanistan who've been fighting forever. And the warlords are so important and whatnot. I'm sorry, ma'am.
I have a question. You didn't really dwell on this or focus on it, but could some of this go back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after the end of the Napoleonic Wars?
Yeah.
And you had Austria, France, Great Britain, and Russia, making the decisions. I don't quite remember what they were.
Yeah, well, the Congress, she asked about, does this go back to the Congress of Vienna, which I mentioned very briefly, but absolutely, yeah. The Congress of Vienna was, okay, we got rid of Bonaparte here, and of course we're going to get a bunch of more Bonapartes, younger Napoleons, nephews and whatnot, in France. But absolutely, what they were trying to do was turn back the hands of time in the Congress of Vienna, trying to go back to the monarchies, trying to go back to the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church playing a very important role. That's not an anti-Roman Catholic Church comment, but they were very political for sure during that time and very strong players. And then trying to set up Europe as basically a system that they could control. And they also combined, for instance, several of the German states and we looked at this when we did the nationalism and unification of Germany in 1871. So yes, absolutely, this was part of that. It's part of the theory or the concept or the belief that these men, and they were all men, basically were smarter than everybody else and could figure it out and knew what was right. And that people of color, people of different religions, didn't have the wherewithal. Comes out of social Darwinism, which we talked about before, which was basically the concept of, well, we Europeans are so powerful because we are Caucasians and European, Western European, and we know better, and that we know what's right for everyone. And that was a very, very strong belief, leading to a lot of the issues we had in this country, obviously, in, you know, the problems for African Americans, for instance, after the Civil War. So, yes, Judy.
My grandfather wanted to leave Poland. They got married around 1901, but my grandmother didn't want to. But 1912, he just picked himself up. And my mother and my grandmother, my mother and aunt, got stuck there. In 1916, he sent tickets on the Holland American line. They just took the train to Rotterdam and waited for the ship. But when she came here, she was about 11, they kept asking her in school about atrocities. Well, nothing happened.
Right.
But she was so happy to get the help. I hate to tell you what my mother called.
Yeah, don't. We're on television, so yeah.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, thanks.
I just wanted to say that about 6 years ago, the State Department asked families if they would take kids from various Muslim countries because they wanted these kids to get to know America, like America, and become pro-American. So we ended up with a kid from Pakistan. His name was Ali. He was 16, and he came here knowing that he was going to go to Concord Carlisle High School, where Concord was and everything else. But he looked like my daughter, who's Korean. So one day after I'd known Ali for several weeks, I said to him, "You don't look like the Pakistanis on the front of this book from the children's department." He said, "No." He said, "We're Hazara." I said, "Hazara? H-A-Z-Z-A-R-A? What's that?" He said, "We are descendants of Genghis Khan, and we are Shiites, and they try to kill us." And so they're very recognizably, facially. So when they have those massacres in different places, they're targeting people like Ali. I learned so much by having this 16-year-old in our house for 6 weeks. It was amazing.
That's a great experience. I want to get just to put a little credence to that, Genghis Khan had something like 200 wives. And so he had a whole bunch of sons, and each one of the sons had like 200 wives. So there are more than 40 million people that are descended from Genghis Khan all throughout Europe. I traveled in the Soviet Union, and you would see lots and lots and lots of people descended from Central Asia and Mongolia. So yeah, it is. Yeah. So sometime I should do a talk on the Mongols. It really is one of my favorite times and very interesting. And again, some really negative stuff and some really positive stuff that the Mongols approached. Well, we've run past our time, and I want, again, June 13th here, the history of the modern Middle East, colonialism, independence, and conflict. And I appreciate so much you all coming again. You do me great honor to come and to listen to me. So thank you very much. And thank Jana for the...